Okay, I think we are ready. Good. Hello, my name is Jorge Sanchez Perez. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, which is located in Treaty 6 territory of the Papache and the Métis Nation. I am pleased to introduce Kristin Rodier, assistant professor of philosophy at Athabasca University in the Center for Humanities. She will present the paper, What is it like to be a fat philosopher? A phenomenology of bodies out of line and out of place. Please don't forget the captioning. You can activate it via click at the bottom of your screen. And please put the questions in the Q&A section instead of the chat, if possible, for the sake of keeping the discussion organized. Also, I would like to apologize for having to leave before the end of the full meeting. I am Peruvian, and there was a coup in Peru, and I was asked to participate in a discussion about how to deal with this from an international perspective. So I am really deeply sorry about missing the last few minutes of the talk, but I am sure that the conference can go on nicely without me. Thank you very much. Kristin, please.
Okay. Hello, thank you for that introduction. I have a handout on my website, and I'm going to put the link in the chat. You can go to kristinrodier.com and the section on presentations, and there's a handout there. It includes information on the talk, bibliographic information, and then also some skeleton notes, so kind of an outline to follow along, because I am going to be reading. So I will start off by saying my pronouns are she, her, and I will describe myself. So I am a white woman. I'm a fat white woman. I've got some red glasses on and an olivey yellow jacket, which on, and some books behind me. I will also acknowledge some land and acknowledge sort of where I am. I'm working on occupied traditional homelands of the Plains Cree, the Woodland Cree, the Beaver Cree, the Plains Ojibwe, and the Métis people. And I want to just say two things about where I'm coming from. So specifically right now, you know, I work at a virtual institution, so we can talk about connection to land in a different way, but I'm in Peonin, which is colonially known as St. Albert, which is and was and is a colonial epicenter of what is now called Western Canada, because, and you can look up his crimes, Bishop Vital Grandin was a powerful person here. Also, the philosophy department at the University of Alberta, where I received my PhD, was safe harbor for John McEachern, who was the chair of the Alberta Eugenics Board from 1929 to 1960. And this board formally continued work until 1972, but that's just formal. Anyway, to keep going with my introductions, I want to thank my co-author, Samantha Brennan, who is not here, but who helped me develop this work. We developed it together. We've now published it in a couple of places. If you'll note if you have the handout up, you'll notice that we presented at the Canadian Society for Women in Philosophy on this topic in 2014. The work got put on a shelf, had a baby, left the job market, got lured back onto the job market, et cetera, and started working at Athabasca in a faculty position in April of 2021. So you can see the three titles develop here. It goes from a sort of tentative, hey, there's fat stigma in the academy, to, well, I think there's fat stigma in teaching, and then the revised and expanded chapter that's going to be in the Bloomsbury Guide is sort of really aiming at the discipline. So anyway, I just want to sort of thank Sam for the faith in the project and the courage to do this work. So what I'm going to present today is a kind of condensed version where I trimmed around some things to focus more on what I'm most comfortable talking about in question period. Samantha has her own expertise. I also want to offer gratitude to Shelley and all the conference organizers, but Shelley specifically for including our paper in the New Bloomsbury Guide. Editorial work, field shaping volumes like that is thankless labor. And so I will thank you for that. The idea that I could luxuriate in these ideas for 50 minutes today with critical disability scholars is just absolutely thrilling to me. One of the recommendations that Sam and I make in our paper is to reflect on whether fat philosophers are invited to give presentations, much less to give presentations on fatness. So the fact that I'm here giving this talk is really a credit to the radical thinking that Shelley brings forward in philosophy. One of the other recommendations we make in our paper is that fat philosophers be very hesitant to even present on fatness. So with that said, here I go. I'm going to do that thing, that slightly obnoxious thing, where I don't present exactly on the title I submitted. Initially, I thought I could put the work in our chapter in conversation with work I'm doing right now, building a critical fat phenomenology, which is what my original title is referring to. In trying to do that, and special thanks to Jorge, because I was kind of sending versions, and sorry about your cluttered email inbox. I realize there's just a few too many steps between this work and that work, although maybe I will take those steps one day. If you want to ask questions about that in the question period, I'm happy to talk about it, but I do reference it in my handout. Okay, with that said, I'm going to hop into the chapter. If you're following along, you can just go to bullet point 1. So our world is not a comfortable place for fat people, especially in, but by no means exclusive to, the academy and academic philosophy. The levels of discomfort that fat people experience vary amongst them, depending on the ways in which they are positioned with respect to disability, race, gender, class, sexuality, and other forms of subjecting social power. In most spaces, to speak of fat oppression puts one on the defensive, that such a form of oppression even exists, even though there are powerful activist movements alongside a significant and growing corpus of scholarly literature that argues for fat's place within the aforementioned overlapping and mutually reinforcing oppressions. While the notion of a fat oppression might call to mind physical discomfort in a world that is not built for fat bodies, including blood pressure cuffs, clothes, school desks, airplane seats, restaurant booths, bathroom stalls. I'm thinking of Jane's presentation. Less attention is paid to less readily perceptible harms, especially social exclusion and emotional discomfort in a culture of intense stigmatization, dehumanization, and violence. Consider, for example, how routinely the term fat is employed as an epithet, despite concerted efforts, decades-long efforts, to reclaim the word. Insofar as philosophers conduct research and teach within and against this cultural and social backdrop of disdain for fat bodies, it is imperative that they ask, how do we engage ethically and critically with fat stigma in our classrooms, our departments, and the profession more generally? In this chapter, we draw on our experiences as fat white women with different relations to ability and other identity factors to reflect on the ways in which our embodied presence in the classroom, that is, our fat teaching bodies, raises questions about philosophical and pedagogical credibility, questions that are tangible when we teach canonical Western philosophical ideas and examples that are implicitly and explicitly fat stigmatizing. Since philosophers are a subset of the general population, we can extrapolate from empirical data on the impacts and pervasiveness of fat stigma, and that this form of stigma and its effects should be reckoned with in all social spaces, including the institutional and discursive space of academic philosophy. Indeed, philosophy may be uniquely positioned to perpetuate certain dominant norms, according to which a thin body is a good body, since such a body represents evidence of rational agency and other virtues. Although fat stigma is, in principle, separable from norms of rational agency, this distinction is rarely made. Thus, we want to argue that given philosophy's disciplinary preoccupation with reason, there are, philosophy-specific ways in which fat phobia is perpetuated. In what follows, we outline how some canonical texts, contemporary thought experiments, and norms of rational agency in general contribute to fat stigma's specific philosophical contours. This chapter focuses on teaching in particular because of its field-shaping impact and reach with students, and because we have extensive experience as fat-bodied philosophy teachers. Pacing, standing, reaching, bending. Something else I was thinking about is erasing the whiteboard, so turning your back and jiggling. That's not in the paper, but maybe it should be. As a fat philosopher or person in front of a room of philosophy students renders its own epistemological standpoint that until now has seldom been discussed. Most mainstream philosophy faculty and the majority of philosophy students have not encountered the significant critique of fat stigma that one finds in the fat studies literature. Though some are familiar with, popular online streams and in-person streams of fat acceptance movements and body neutrality movements. Fat studies initially drew on research rooted in a critique of the cultural turn at the end of the 19th century, where fatness is in especially elite white contexts. Okay, so this is the fat studies turn. Fat studies initially drew on research rooted in a critique of the cultural turn at the end of the 19th century, where fatness, in especially elite white contexts, came to signify gluttony, ill health, and even a lapse in patriotic duty. This critique continues to expand in focus and historical reach in order to better identify how contemporary social concerns about an obesity epidemic are linked to eugenics movements, scientific racism, and the transatlantic slave trade. In short, fat stigma is not merely the modern result of a predatory diet and weight loss industry. And if you want to know more about my critiques there, I sort of have other work that I'm working on about how fat critiques get collapsed in feminism into a kind of critique of diet and weight loss industries. And I just think it expands way bigger than that. And it needs to be rethought. But rather, it's a tool. Fat stigma is a tool and an effect of the ongoing work of imperialism, scientific racism, and colonialism. So now we're into section 2, which has been condensed and chopped a little bit, but free-floating knowers and fat-bodied eaters. So for those of you familiar, that heading kind of is evoking Lorraine Coe's work a little bit. Much work has been done in the last 25 years to critique, 25 plus years to critique a masculinist culture in the discipline of philosophy and increase the participation in philosophy of white, non-disabled, and cisgender women in the profession of philosophy. Starting to get dry. Earlier landmark texts have shown that philosophy must grapple with the influence of sexism in the canon, especially how it formulates good reasoners. Feminist philosophers have critiqued the refrain in philosophy according to which historical philosophy texts can be discussed and interpreted from a value-neutral lens, both in classrooms in particular and in philosophy journals and the profession more generally. Although some change with respect to demographics of the academy have taken place, diversity initiatives tend to overrepresent white women, and we would add white women with thin body types. Behind the failures of a lot of these diversity initiatives are long-standing meta-commitments within philosophy that are difficult to shake loose about what is an important or profound philosophical project. And here I'm evoking Christy Dotson's work, Shelley Tremaine's work, Jorge's excellent work on defining philosophical projects. And just to throw the cat into the pigeons here, as my dissertation supervisor would say, I have a schematized list of philosophical areas at the end of my handout where I think there could be analysis around fat, but it doesn't seem to register. However, philosophy characteristically keeps historical ideas alive in the present. I myself have met many Kantians, Cartesians, Spinozans, all kinds of different identities of historical schools of thought. Thus, we must discuss what it means to responsibly engage with these ideas. In Sabrina Strings' book, Fearing the Black Body, subtitle, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, which I recommend highly. She surveys some of the Western philosophical tradition and art traditions, actually, from the science, anyway, from the 17th century onward, detailing how a very specific white, male, and slender ideal emerges from the epistemologies and metaphysics of several important thinkers. As String shows, these white male thinkers align the fleshiness in the bodies of white men as evidence they cannot be proper English intellectuals. And furthermore, quote, thinness was seen as more befitting the intelligent, self-possessed white male, unquote. She argues that fat phobia enforces normative whiteness, but the way that it does that is to denigrate and oppress racialized others, or sort of there's two ends of the barbell here. String's book outlines how North American race-making projects used fatness as a marker of, quote, savage blackness, an identifiable degenerative trait deemed to prove Black bodies inferior. So against these, sort of canonical texts, canonical ideas and thinkers where, the body and the mind, as the body and mind as kind of co-constituting evidence for each other's, value is the background in which we're teaching these ideas. We're teaching these ideas and coming into contact with them all of the time. So, and then we have a cultural fat stigma. So then we wade into that with our bodies and teach. And so the next section 3, is called Teaching Traps, which is where we try to, I think, teach about things that don't have anything to do with that, the body or fatness, but it's there. And so a common occurrence when you are hyper aware of fat stigma is to notice when it informs classroom discussions that do not even mention fatness or eating. Consider a teaching example. A person has a heart attack on the subway platform and collapses. Pushing an innocent bystander off the platform, actually, not to editorialize, but the earlier presentation this morning about philosophers conceive of things in armchairs. I love riffing on titles, and I was thinking philosophers kill people from their armchairs, because that is something that we're constantly coming up with different ways. Anyway, so this person is causally responsible. Okay, so a person has a heart attack, falls into an innocent bystander, they fall in front of the train and die. This person is causally responsible for the person dying, but they are not morally blameworthy for the death because they did not intentionally push the victim off the platform. The example of the distinction between causal responsibility and moral responsibility, at least for me in teaching, regularly backfires. However, since students often argue that somehow the person caused their own heart attack by failing to prevent it. I don't think I'm paranoid in suggesting, or at least Sam and I both don't feel paranoid in suggesting, that one's teaching body primes students to read the example this way. Thus, we get covert messages from students about our moral failures. This just raises the question, who do our students conjure in their minds as having the heart attack? Is it the marathon runner who has an unexpected chronic total obstruction? Or is the hypothetical a fat, stressed out businessman who eats terribly, perhaps smokes and drinks too much coffee, maybe even popping antacids, who knows? Students reveal who had the heart attack specifically when they repeat, and they have multiple times, that the person should have exercised and eaten better. Such common remarks demonstrate the lengths to which we hold people responsible for their health and illustrates how philosophical discussions, according to which the mind controls the body, can slip into extreme versions of bodily control with moral implications. What this and other teaching traps demonstrate is that dominant norms of rational minds, evidenced on thin bodies, align with contemporary neoliberal ableist values of, among other things, individualism, self-sufficiency, discipline, and freedom of the will. The communication of philosophers' ideas to our students demands that we wrestle with cultural understandings that our ideas evoke. Even as teaching aesthetics, which is judgments of taste, is salient, as stereotypical representations of fat people convey they eat junky, mass-produced food in contrast to thinner people of refined taste. In essence, fat people encapsulate those who are not smart enough to tame their desires, nor make enlightened or refined choices. And thus, by implication, if they manage to get there at all, they make subpar philosophers. Section 4. Hope I'm doing okay for time. And I hope I'm not going too fast. Okay, the next section is about stereotype threat, except that's more of Sam's specialty, so it's condensed a little bit. Philosophers who must appear in face-to-face classrooms must do so with their bodies. Since dominant understandings project a bundle of failures onto fat bodies, fat philosophers who fail to have a normal, quote, normal professor body carry character stigmas and experience credibility gaps they must negotiate in the classroom. Importantly, insofar as philosophy focuses in unique ways on teaching reasoning skills, which includes modeling and perceptions of expertise, fat-bodied philosophers experience stereotype threat in this regard. In the longer discussion of stereotype threat, we talk about our positionalities, some examples of negotiating stigma, and that in order to persist, fat philosophers often have to overcompensate, perhaps even performing a hyper-rationality. Credibility is crucial in teaching environments, since students' perception of credibility affects how they approach ideas different from their own. While we do not contend credibility is attained solely through embodiment, we nevertheless think it is an important contributing factor to one's perception of expertise in teaching and research. The idea of the most advanced body having the highest intellect reiterates eugenic hierarchies, where lower bodies are marked for manual labor. Contemporary media disproportionately represents fat white men's bodies as signifying a working class position of downward mobility. Furthermore, social concerns about a healthy and industrializing labor pool intersect fatness and disability, since a healthy body is independent, self-sufficient, and enterprising. Since philosophy often considers itself to be the highest form of intellectual labor, contemplation, the mind must be of the highest quality, and the body is evidence of both intelligence and a rational will. Kate Mann's recent article observes that this sizest and ablest association between the mind and the body appears even in captions in philosophy texts, and I love her example that she gives. I was recently apprised of a caption on a portrait of David Hume, the 18th century philosopher, in an introductory textbook. This is the caption. The lightness and quickness of his mind was entirely hidden by the lumpishness of his appearance. Thus have other philosophers been warned that our bodies may similarly mask our intellects, unquote. It's from Kate Mann. In short, our argument is not that fat stigma causes stereotype threat only, or even primarily, when philosophers are teaching about fat, which strictly speaking would be rare. We maintain rather that being a fat philosopher carries stereotypes that are salient anytime we teach, and especially when we teach about desire, agency, rationality, aesthetics, the good life, topics central to most teaching in the discipline. Teaching philosophy can thus reinforce the stigmatization of fatness, reinforcing that fat people are irrational because we do not monitor our health properly, and that it is irrational for fat people to even attempt to be philosophers precisely because they have limited capacity for rationality. So now we're on to section 5. Magical train stopping. Okay. As we outlined above, wrestling with dominant understandings, stereotypes, and stigmas is a complex task. Low-hanging fruit, perhaps, are instances where nameless fat-bodied people appear in contemporary analytic ethics, thought experiments, an area of philosophy dominated by real-life cases and thought experiments about who we can kill. Typically, older people, disabled people, people who use drugs in certain ways, and so on, and why they are a drain on resources, a burden, do not contribute, and so on. Probing our biases and generating epistemic and hermeneutical injustices has been discussed in brilliant ways so far in this conference. The cases of disability and euthanasia used in thought experiments often pay little attention to legacies that construct disability as an objective, prediscursive bodily inferiority that operates as a model for other acts in which lives deemed to have less value are measured. Here we're drawing on Shelley's 2017 monograph. Disability and fatness thus share contemporary legacies of this disparagement and disqualification by professions specifically designed for the classification, management, and disciplining oversight of bodily difference, including medicine, charity, social work, public health policy, and so on. Teaching hypotheticals in the discipline continue to be taught despite significant literature criticizing the use of such thought experiments, suggesting that they reinforce stereotypes, diminish perceptions of harm, not to mention the objections to them that numerous disabled philosophers of disability have raised. To return to earlier discussions of heart issues, hypotheticals used outside of ethics can also dehumanize fat people in ways that overlap illness and disability. For example, in a critical thinking course, there's a textbook where this example is used, presenting the fallacy of accident, where the claim is that cross-country skiing is good for one's heart. Therefore, quote, Mr. Fat Body should go cross-country skiing. So this is a mistake. Mr. Fat Body should not go cross-country skiing because, well, the idea with the fallacy of accident is that you have a rule, but there are special conditions which block the application of that rule, and the body here is the reason not to apply the rule. In this hypothetical, the very fact that a body is fat is deployed not only to name and dehumanize the person, but also as a sine qua non for cardiac illness. That means he has a cardiac illness. Insofar as Mr. Fat Body is reduced to his body in this hypothetical, the examples and others like it fails, and as we intend to argue, undermine teaching. So many of you are probably familiar with trolley problems. That's one of the things that philosophy kind of gets discussed in relation to in popular culture. There's this whole area of trolleyology and lifeboat ethics. In response to a trolley problem in 1985, Judith Jarvis Thompson comes up with this famous fat man example. And it still is widely taught. People are publishing books with fat man in the title. It's regularly in edited volumes. This is really run-of-the-mill introductory philosophy teaching stuff. In the example, one is asked whether a fat person should be thrown over a bridge to stop a train from killing 5 other people. The idea is that you would be ducking the hypothetical of this moral problem, let's say, unless you grant that the fat man's bulk is sufficient to stop a train. The casual, brutal violence in this example, and we go into another one in the paper about exploding a fat person to save others as well. There's lots of this, Anyway, it works alongside ubiquitous ways in which violence against fat people is minimized in popular media reporting, and court cases, and so on. If you're interested in some of that, I have a paper on sexual violence against fat women as portrayed in the media and how that is downplayed and erased and so on. You can find that on my website. While these in-class discussions can be unruly, I hated teaching these and feel bad that I did ever. Evoking laughter at the fat person's demise, some students do point out that even the fattest person could not stop a train. In addition, in addition to these issues, the pedagogical goal may well be undermined. since stereotypical shorthand such as fat stigma really put one's thumb on the scale. Like if this is supposed to be doing some kind of utilitarian calculus where 1 versus 5 is some kind of ethical problem, you're really not 1 versus 5. Teaching these examples while fat is especially unpleasant because students will openly say that insofar as the fat man does not care about himself, he may as well save 5 people. These kinds of teaching moments are very difficult and synthesize the larger issues we've been outlining about normal professor bodies. If it is a philosopher's prerogative to teach analytic ethics with highly constructed thought experiments, such as these odious hypotheticals, then the practice itself certainly calls for moral and pedagogical justification. So, to conclude section 6 in the handout, what can we do differently? Not to be too punny, there is no one-size-fits-all recommendation to reduce fat stigma in classrooms or the discipline. An immediate and achievable recommendation is to discontinue teaching thought experiments that explicitly refer to a person's body shape, size, or weight. Given that these thought experiments are meant to elicit intuitions of the moral parameters of the case, and furthermore, given that we know the extent to which widely held intuitions about ability, race, and size are untrustworthy, there are reasons to avoid characterizing people in these ways. As we have noted, these adjustments to a well-known problem of the discipline involve risks, whose consequences, so for example, I'm not going to teach fat man hypotheticals, let's say. Who says that, where they say it, how they're positioned, what their body's like, this can ruffle feathers, I think. And I'd be interested in different people's perspective on that. As we've noted, it involves risks. And the consequences differ from one philosopher to another. That is, one's relative power and job prospects need to be taken into account when one considers pedagogical adjustments that talk back to the accepted framing of philosophical problems. If it is true that stigma affects job prospects in most professions, and if, as we've been arguing, professional philosophy is not immune to this stigma and might be worse than other academic disciplines and other professions in some respects, although we don't have a comparative study for that, philosophers should pause to consider why. Is it possible that entrance requirements, hiring, and funding decisions are made partially based on reading a motivational profile, which translates into philosophical ability from a certain kind of body? When a quick Google search can produce a picture of almost anyone, especially keen graduate students who cultivate professional online presences, attractiveness and normative embodiment are likely to play a role. Whatever is meant by professorial appearance, which includes hairstyle, clothing choices, and weight, normative gender is slender, as my cohort scholar friend Lucas Crawford says. Whatever is meant by professorial appearance, which includes hairstyle, clothing choices, and weight, has an impact on one's teaching evaluations and job prospects. Let us here not speak of job interview dinners that elicit demonstrations of one's judgments of taste and fit for faculty club chairs. Faculty regularly dismiss student evaluations as highly reducible to perceptions of professors as attractive or unattractive. And as teachers and disciplinary members, we should ask ourselves whether we hold these same biases and to what extent they affect our evaluation of work that unattractive and or fat students and prospective colleagues submit. These biases affect formal and informal mentoring, as well as institutionally gatekeep the profession. It will take more than individual reflection to undermine these biases. It will require we continue to foster critical approaches to the structures that maintain and solidify bodily hierarchies. So it would be nice to end this chapter on a positive note. I don't know if it would be, but it's not like philosophers invented fat phobia. but it really depends on who one claims in their intellectual tradition. Canonical and lesser known Western philosophers have canonical and lesser known Western philosophers have spurred eugenic intellectual traditions that underpin empire building and colonialism. For we who teach now, the implication is this: how are we bringing critical approaches to these ideas in our classrooms, given that there's such significant teaching traps everywhere? Given that a fear of fatness has longstanding residency in significant parts of our psyches, government, and medical authorities, this implication cannot be ignored, but must be handled with care. Unless we want students to continue to learn that fat prejudice is acceptable in philosophy, compounding intersectional oppressions and leading to, among other things, less credibility for fat professors. Our fat students, who persistently grapple with questions of belonging in our discipline, are paying close attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. That was terrific. Very, very comprehensive and informed by practical, personal, and textual discourse. So I don't see any questions yet. Perhaps, well, I guess I could ask you, where do you see your project in this area going forward?
I think this is one of the challenges of reflecting on the discipline, because it intersects canonical ideas, critical work within that, our own experiences, teaching, how we teach, professional issues. Like, it's just so expansive. And, my answer to that is I'm probably going to think more of it in terms of teaching myself going forward. I'm not an analytic ethicist, although I've had to develop those skills for teaching reasons. So that wouldn't really be my direction, but I don't really know. Probably somewhere in teaching.
Okay, that's fine. We have two questions so far. The first is from Dr. Cecilia Munn. Thank you, Kristin, for your presentation. I appreciate the general point that you are making about the way in which philosophers integrate quote unquote fatness in their philosophizing is a problem. But I'm wondering to what extent you believe that this is problematic. For example, you noted trolley examples. You might say that some trolley examples that use a fat person can help us actually get at address biases against fat people. Would you be against that as well?
So I would really have to know how reconstructed the hypothetical would be for that to be successful. As they exist now, I mean, yeah, Samantha and I had this discussion about, do you continue teaching them, but frame them differently, or get students to reflect on them as you're teaching them? My suggestion is I'm so convinced by what's been written on the ineffectiveness of these kinds of highly constructed hypotheticals that I personally wouldn't be trying to fix them in any way. And then if the question is more about using them to get students to reflect on fat stigma, I just think there's so much other literature to do that. I wouldn't be doing it with something that names somebody by a bodily characteristic, like hypotheticals do. Yeah.
Okay. There's a question from Ray in the Q&A section, and then I'll take a question from Emily Parker. So Ray asks, first comments and then asks a question. Not teaching horrible dehumanizing thought experiments is a really helpful and actionable piece of advice. Thank you. Sadly, it's not just normative ethics. I run into awful ones in my home discipline decision theory too. Do you have other practical advice that goes further for those of us with enough power to implement them?
Wow. People with ability to implement them. Well, I think, yeah, so the practical advice, it's really tough. I mean, I would teach this is why we have a section on teaching traps. I would teach something about, weakness of the will or Aristotle, or, and you have a student body that is really completely, encapsulated by diet and weight loss, fat negativity. And so if you try to explain these moral problems, like, I really want to be someone who, has a clean car, but I still leave garbage on the floor of my car, or something like that. You explain to them you want something, but you don't achieve it. And then you get them to write a reflection on it. 95% of them will be writing about how they want to go to the gym, but they don't. It just gets gobbled up, or they want to eat more healthy and they don't. Like, it's just such a forefront problem. So that's the kind of teaching unruliness, right? But if you have actual, power to influence discipline, I would say encourage and invite work on this topic, and really scrap the fat man hypotheticals. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, Emily Parker has a question. So Emily, why don't you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, Kristin.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this paper. I really enjoyed it, and it's got me thinking about, Beauvoir. Firstly, there's a two-part question. The first part is, do you find any resources for, like, I'm completely convinced 1,000% about scrapping the fat man hypothetical. I mean, wow, such important work. But like, kind of after that, do you find any, or in addition to that, like, do you find any resources in Beauvoir for thinking about this project? Or, I mean, I asked this a little bit because I worry that there is a kind of, I don't know what you would want to call it, but kind of fat phobia in Beauvoir. I don't know if you agree with that. Like, I would like to know what you think of that. That's my
that sounds like a paper that needs to be written.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I want to know what you think before I would take it any further. But it's something I've been already kind of thinking about, but like, your paper is just making me think about it even more. And then the other thing would be, do you think that there would be ways of thinking about this question outside of, like, the Platonic tradition, the analytic tradition? What other schools of philosophy globally might say about fatness? I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't expect there to be much positivity, honestly, but I don't know if you have, looked in other literatures, or your thoughts on that.
Well,
Thank you for your paper.
yeah, the first question, I'd be fascinated because Beauvoir was sort of a principal figure for my own research coming into my PhD. And I did work on her in my dissertation. And of course, I had my eyes open the whole time about whether there were comments here and there. But I think there could be something to think about in the idea of the flesh of the body and how that symbolizes against transcendence but she's such a ambivalent thinker around, like, this is what the philosophers would say, but I'm not a philosopher, or this is what the norm is and I'm going to talk about it, versus like there's always kind of an ambivalence in that work. But yeah, we do have an issue with, I'm thinking about Susan Bordeaux's work, even about like transcendence versus like the body, and how that works with even Cartesianism, which is, there in existential phenomenology big time. The second part of your question is about whether there are frames that think differently about the body outside of analytic philosophy. More generally, wow, that's a good question. I'd have to think about that. I think that's part of why I'm looking to critical phenomenology as a kind of way of reorienting the question towards thinking about the body in social and cultural norms and experiencing of that body, and trying to find the limits of the body as flesh and the body as it is made to be a certain kind of flesh in society. And so sort of figuring out that navigation, that's where my project's going. Cool. But yeah, it's thank you for your question.
Okay, I put a link in the chat. It's from Cecilia Munn, who has sent it because it gives examples of the sort of kind of trolley problems that Cecilia has in mind. I'm going to read a comment from Corinne, and then a question or another comment from Audrey Yap. So Corinne Lajoie says, amazing talk. Thank you, Kristin. While listening, I was thinking of connections between your talk and Emily's. Fat people are overly willful. Example, they are gluttonous. They also lack in will. For example, the fat man is responsible for not exercising. This is an invitation to talk more about this willfulness and deficient willing at the heart of that stigma, exclamation mark.
Cool.
And on to Audrey's. Audrey Yap says, thank you so much for this talk, exclamation mark. Totally agree with all the problems about teaching terrible thought experiments, following up on Ray here. I wonder if you're optimistic or even just to have thoughts about any possibilities of playing with our embodied identity as an instructor in ways that might subvert norms. I'm thinking about messing with teaching problematic people like Kant as a person of color. Hopefully this is a clear enough question.
Yeah. That's interesting. I work at an online university now, and I don't take my body into a classroom in the same way as I used to. And so I don't have the ability to experiment in the same way. So I really like the question, but I haven't been thinking about that. And I think it's kind of interesting too, to think about issues around the profession and the discipline, and about whose minds are perceived as, intellectual, as being connected to these hypotheticals, right? So when we throw out those hypotheticals, let's say, as I'm hearing a lot of people are on board with doing, I really sort of want to just push that a little bit more to say, how does that connect to, or can we think about it also as connected to the norms of the profession that have kept that there in place and so central for so long? The paper gets into more areas of microaggressions and feelings of not belonging. And, I don't want it to seem as though I'm saying, fat people are just as good as, the best rational philosophers or whatever. I really want to subvert that, that sort of norm around how we best display minds or whatever, how we conceive of who makes a good philosopher or what a good philosopher is. I think these norms are shot through really problematically about who's profound, who's a genius, whose ideas are important. This is why I brought up these metacritical issues early on. How does this sort of permeate more levels is my bigger question. So sorry, Audrey, that didn't really go to what you were saying particularly, but.
I think that was an excellent response.
Thanks.
So I think that we have come to the end of our time here. So if we want to just close off the session, maybe I will just say that I hope that people will join us tomorrow. And at the end of tomorrow, there will be a social, so people can get together and talk to each other about what they've heard over the previous 4 days, and talk more about people's ideas. Jamie, our tech person, will be sending a link for that because we have to go to a separate Zoom room to do that. So he will be sending that tomorrow. Did you want to add anything, Jonathan?
I was only going to say the things that you have already just said. So just to thank everyone today, and looking forward to interacting with everyone who can make it, and maybe some others as well tomorrow. So I think we bring it to a close, Shelley, unless you have anything else to add now.
No, I see that there are 2 comments from Owen in the Q&A, but I'm afraid that we have, do you want to just quickly look at them, Kristin, or?
So we can save those. I think the comments will automatically be saved. Is that right, Jamie? You there?
Yes, we can take note of those.
Great. Okay, so they can be passed on. So nothing will be lost.
Okay, great.
Okay, good. Okay, so we bring it to a close for tonight. Another incredible day, and look forward to tomorrow. So good day, as they say in Australia, which is suitably ambiguous for different time zones. Okay.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming. Come back tomorrow.